Hello, my name is Galilea Rodriguez. I'm from El Paso, Texas, in the United States of America. I'm 14 years old and I attend Harmony Science Academy where I am a freshman. For my project this year, I completed an elemental analysis through light emittance of a plasma discharge globe in a hollow cathode. In this day and age, people are in constant concern of what they are putting in their bodies and how it affects their health. Something they may not know is that there can be various heavy metal concentrations in the very soils in which we grow our crops in. And eventually, as we consume these crops, we are being exposed to these harmful metals, and eventually they are making their way into our bodies. So this is why it is important for scientists and people to be able to identify what heavy metals are contaminating various soils. This is why the use of spectroscopy and the use of hollow cathode lamps are very important. So to start off, spectroscopy. There are two different types of spectroscopy: atomic absorption spectroscopy and emission spectroscopy. So the way atomic absorption spectroscopy is when electrons from the inner shells jump to the outer shells of the electron, when various energies are applied in the form of waveforms, such as when voltages are applied to these electrons. And the way emission spectroscopy works is when these electrons jump from outer shells to inner shells, and therefore releasing energy in the same manner, where they release waveforms in the form of energy. So both of these forms of spectroscopy require the use of a hollow cathode lamp. The hollow cathode lamp is where the metal or the particular soil is placed inside of, and eventually it may be diluted inside of the hollow cathode lamp in order to be able to detect what type of metal is contaminating these various materials. Not only can metal be contaminating soils, but they can also be contaminating plastics, which can be the source for children's toys. And as we know, children, sometimes they may end up putting these toys inside of their mouths, and eventually they'll also be exposed to these heavy metals, which can be harmful to them and to our environment. The problem that inspired me to conduct my background research is that metals are often encountered in areas in which we may require their absence, and if organisms consume these metals in a surplus, then it may be toxic to the animal, and in many cases, these metals can be considered contaminants. I asked myself, by using a hollow cathode lamp and the method of emission spectroscopy, is it possible for me to complete an elemental analysis of various metals that are located inside of the cathode of my hollow cathode lamp? This is what led me to my purpose. The purpose of my project is to examine the difference in wavelength intensity emitted by 4 different metals. These 4 metals consist of copper, zinc, tin, and calcium. And I wanted to be able to identify these different metals with the method of emission spectroscopy with a spectrometer. And for my engineering goal, it was to build my own hollow cathode lamp that I can use to identify metallic elements that can be considered contaminants and harmful to human health. And for my hypothesis, by constructing a functioning hollow cathode lamp, I will be able to place different metals inside of the cathode. And soon after the lamp is ignited, the plasma will begin to emit light, which should be doped with the pertaining metals located inside of the cathode. And using a spectrometer and the method of emission spectroscopy, I will be able to identify the wavelength of these various metals and allow for the various elements to be identified. For the experimental part of my project, I was able to identify my variables. So my variables, I identified my independent one to be the element and amount of voltage. My dependence variable was the wavelength, form, and intensity, and my controls variable, I used the same type of hollow cathode lamp and the same type of lens. For my experiment, I conducted 2 different tests for 4 different elements to be able to identify their wavelength intensity and how it corresponds to their spectral lines. The 4 different elements I tested were copper, zinc, tin, and calcium at 2 different voltages, which were 10,000 volts and 15,000 volts. I secured each lamp using my anode electrode and the quartz glass lens. I vacuumed the lamps at a pressure of 27 inches of mercury, and I placed the different metals inside of the cathode of my hollow cathode lamp. I applied the voltage to my anode and my cathode of my hollow cathode lamp, and I used the plasma discharge globe to be able to identify the wavelength intensity using a spectrometer and the method of emission spectroscopy. I built a total of 6 different hollow cathode lamps before finding the prototypes that worked best to conduct my experiments. Here's the final prototype that I used in order to conduct my experiments. Inside of the cathode, I placed the various elements in order to be able to identify the wavelength intensity of each element. And during my background research, I collected estimations for each spectral line with each element that I was going to test in nanometers. So here in my graphs, I have the wavelength or the measurements of nanometers in the spectral lines that I was going to use to test the different elements. And I tested each element at 2 different volts to see how closely related they were to the spectral lines that I found during my background research. So here I have my zinc, copper, tin, and calcium. Now, at the 10,000 volts, the correlation between the wavelength intensity and the spectral lines were evident. And at 15,000 volts, I found an even greater correlation between the two. And as people become more mindful of the heavy metals and contaminants they bring into their homes, they can be able to use different methods to be able to identify what is contaminating these various materials. They can use the 2 different methods of either emission spectroscopy or atomic absorption spectroscopy. And as for me, I was able to build my own hollow cathode lamp in which I can be able to identify various heavy metals that can be contaminating different materials. By using the method of emission spectroscopy with a spectrometer, I was able to identify the various heavy metals that I placed inside of the cathode of my hollow cathode lamp. Currently, the processes that are used to identify various heavy metals that are contaminating soils can be very costly. But with the system that I was able to construct, I was able to identify various heavy metals while it's not being very costly. And now for my judges' questions. So for the first question I was asked was, do you see the future application of your project? If yes, what could be the 3 main tasks you do first? Well, let me take you to my garden. As a result from the current pandemic, my family and I took it upon ourselves to plant our own home garden. For my first task, I would like to apply the knowledge I gained from my experiment and use it to identify if there are any heavy metals contaminating our soils, and if so, what percentage of these metals are contaminating our soils. Not only do metals contaminate soils, but they also contaminate plastic as well. For my second task, I would like to use my HCl to identify if there are any metals contaminating children's toys, because as we know, children have a tendency to put toys in their mouths, and eventually they may consume this metal as well. For my third task, I would like to be able to use my hollow cathode lamp to be able to gather information on gases found in our atmosphere, and perhaps how much of a specific gas. And plants, as we know it, release oxygen into our atmosphere through photosynthesis. With my hollow cathode lamp, I may be able to observe how efficient various plants release oxygen. And for my second question, I was asked, what was one of the most interesting lessons from your project? Well, the thing I found most interesting was the quantum mechanics behind the spectroscopy and how various electrons move from each shell when different energies are applied to it. I think that was something that was very interesting and really caught my eyes. For my third question, I was asked, if you had to do it all over again, what would you do differently? Well, for my experiment this time, I didn't dilute the samples. And with the knowledge I've gained, next time I would like to dilute the samples in order to get more accurate results. Although I did get correspondent wavelength intensities to each element's spectral lines, next time I would like to be able to have accurate results that are more closely related to what is actually collected from the data. And for my fourth question, I was asked, how did you come up with the idea of your project? Well, let me take you back to my background research. In this day and age, people are in constant concern of what they are putting in their bodies and how it affects their health. And something they may not know is that various heavy metals can be contaminating the very soils in which we grow our crops in. And even here at home, we've been trying to eliminate the release of pollutants that we emit into the environment.